Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar of the Global Environmental Law Centre. We cannot be more excited to end our year off on a really significant topic, and I'm excited to introduce you then to our speaker today, who is Dr. Kata Doza. She is a postdoctoral research associate in the Law and Development Research Group at the University of Antwerp Law Faculty, and a guest lecturer at Vrije Universiteit Brussels, Brussels School of Governance. Her research interests include areas of environmental and climate change law linked to human rights, in particular children's rights. She holds an LLM, a Master in Journalism, an Advanced Master of Children's Rights, and a PhD in law. She has worked for the European Commission as a press officer for climate action and a policy officer for the rights of the child. Her PhD at the University of Antwerp focused on environmental citizenship and public participation of children in climate change governance. Her current research explores children's access to physical and legal spaces of public participation, as well as various forms of representation of children's voices for climate justice. We're really happy to have you, Kata. And before you start, just one or two house rules and logistics. Kata will present for about 30 minutes, whereafter we will give opportunity for questions. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we ask that since we're going to record, you're welcome to put your camera off if you do not want to be on the recording. Thank you. Kata, you may start. I'm really excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much, Angela. Can you hear me well?
We can, yes.
Super. Okay, great. So thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here today. It's an honor. And a special thanks to the Global Environmental Law Center and the Faculty of Law of the University of Western Cape, and to you, Angela, for inviting me to this webinar. And I'm here today to talk about my recent book, which is titled Children as Climate Citizens. And it provides socio-legal approach to different forms and pathways of public participation of children in climate change matters. So first of all, I hope my slides will move because on my screen they don't. Just 1 second. I really hope this will work. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's just slow a little bit. It's just slow a little bit, but let's hope it's going to work. And I apologize in advance. Sometimes I will read my notes because I tend to speak a lot more than I am intended to. So I don't want to exceed the time limit. But first of all, I wanted to talk to you about why I chose a socio-legal approach to this topic, because my book is primarily based on PhD research in law and in children's rights. But it started in 2015, I completed the research in 2021. And during this period, there was a lot of new development around children being involved in climate change matters, especially in social movement activism and in an increasing number of climate change litigations. So I wanted to look at how these experiences and activities and perceptions of young people are reflecting on their rights given by children's rights legal framework and also environmental law framework. But I also wanted to look at how this experience of children and also their demands and actions have an impact in return on policymaking and even on legal developments. So I chose to first to set basically a theoretical framework to children as climate citizens. And then I looked at the legal framework at hand, what provides the possibility of children acting as climate citizens and participate in certain public participatory processes. And then I looked at what happens on the ground. I looked at 3 major pathways of public participation. at the global level in United Nations conferences on climate change and on more broadly on sustainable development and environmental matters. And then I looked at the grassroots social movement activism of children in the climate change context, and also how they are involved and how they participate in strategic climate change litigation. So first of all, I want to start with explaining what I mean by children, adolescents, and youth in the book, because these have specific meanings in terms of defining children as climate citizens. So the child is a legal term. It's provided by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it applies to persons below the age of 18 years. Adolescent is not an express legal term, but it is referred to by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And the committee defines adolescence as a period between the age of 10 and 18 years of age. And then youth is a very interesting term, and in the context, it depends on the context, basically. So it can apply to children as well, especially in Anglophone cultures. It's often used as a synonym for children in the public language, but also in academia. However, in the policy context and in governance processes, youth has been more increasingly being referred to young adults, which doesn't really apply to children in practice. So with regard to my book, youth has a special meaning, especially in the chapter on children's and youth involvement in the United Nations governance system. And I will talk about this later and explain it to you. So what I mean by children as climate citizens. I have to emphasize that this is a non-legal concept that I developed for this book. This is more of a theoretical or abstract notion that applies to a set of expressed views and actions and experiences of young people, especially children, who want to participate in public matter, specifically climate change, which really concerns them, and also it affects them. It's a matter that has a tremendous impact on children. So this is, as I said, not a legal term, but more of an abstract term. It's not linked to the national sovereignty, and it's not a territorial concept. So it is also a global concept. So I mean, by global, I mean that children, when they practice active climate citizenship, they are linked across the globe through various actions and tools in physical spaces and also across digital spaces. Climate citizenship can be also understood as a set of rights that are provided primarily by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, because this convention provides children citizenship rights that are usually associated with adults, such as the right to participate in public decision-making, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to freedom of association, and the right to information on public matters. So these rights provide entitlements to children to practice their citizenship in climate change matters. However, one of the findings of my research was that even though children have these entitlements, they are often, their citizenships are often limited and restricted to basically not being involved directly in decision making, and their activities don't have much impact on climate change decisions, especially at the global level. So they tend to, as climate citizens, they tend to employ many different means and tools, which I refer to as pathways of public participation. And among those, there are three major paths, which is the formal or traditional understanding of public participation, such as being participating in governance processes, consultations and conferences, political negotiations, basically. And then there are other means, such as the grassroots social movements and climate change litigations. But there are also other alternatives of practicing public participation. First, I am a lawyer. So I wanted to look at public participation from a rights-based approach, because I believe that children do have the right to public participation in climate change matters. And if you look at the scale and the three blocks that I drew on it, you look at the top one, which says the right to public participation, and it's really blurred and it's hardly visible. And it's not a coincidence. So you really have to lean forward and look at it more closely. And this is what I did for my research. I had to scrutinize every instrument at hand, which means legal documents, conventions, treaties, soft law documents, implementation guidelines, and policy papers that provide children the right to participate in decision-making about climate change. So first of all, of course, the United Nations CRC provides the right to participate in decision-making in matters that affect children. And then I identified another international, rather regional treaty, which is the Aarhus Convention, which provides as one of the pillars of democratic environmental governance, public participation. And this treaty does not exclude children from the rights holders groups. So this means that children can also refer to the Aarhus Convention when they claim their rights to public participation. And then I also identified soft law documents which represent the stakeholder and the good governance notions, and providing children and young people as stakeholders, as identified, affected, and vulnerable groups to climate change, to sit at the table and have the right to be consulted on climate change matters. The most important document that I also discussed in the book is the Agenda 21, which at the United Nations level established institutionalized bases for civil society groups, among those the major group of children and youth in sustainability and climate change and environmental matters. But then when we look at public participation in reality, it all comes down to how the duty bearers perceive these rights and how they are willing to implement them in a meaningful way, whether they choose to opt for meaningfulness or tokenism, whether they give spaces to children to have an influence on decisions, or whether they marginalize or don't even listen to them, or whether they want to invite them to the table or discriminate against children on the basis of their age. There is also another aspect that duty bearers often refer to, which is the vulnerability of children and that they need protection, and the fact that they are so young and they are minors excludes them for excludes them from participatory processes, especially at high-level conferences, because it's really difficult to provide child-safe spaces of participation and also child-friendly processes. So, of course, we face with questions about alternatives. And this is what I refer to as what ifs questions. And I will read to you a couple of examples. So one is from Laura Lundy, who says that tokenism can actually serve to ignite more criticism or resistance, or the search for other means of getting involved for children. So children may opt for even more radical pathways of participation, such as activism and protests, and also filing lawsuits in courts. And then some scholars, like, for example, Dana Fisher, argues that grassroots movements should build coalitions. So children, since they don't have a real power to exert influence, even through their social movement activism on governance decisions, they should join forces with adult social movements, and also maybe even to employ more radical ways of activism, because that's the way how to pressure more, to put more pressure on governments to act on climate change. And then there are voices which advocate for lowering the minimum age of public participation and involving young people, maybe from 16 years on or even younger. And that can be linked, this idea can be linked to another other suggestion from Alan Desmet, who says that the right to self-identification could be also a solution, which means that she basically argues that childhood could be determined on a more flexible basis in order to provide a possibility for children themselves to identify as children or no longer children. So this way they could join to other stakeholder groups that they find more impactful. And of course, there is the question of providing children the right to vote and the right, basically, power to participate and to have a direct influence on climate governance. But I argue in my book that this is not necessarily the right solution, because it's not directly linked with public participation of children. So even in those countries where children have the right to vote from the age of 16, for example, in Brazil or Austria, children still go out in the street and protest in large numbers for more effective climate action, and their voting rights is not enough. They don't find it enough to have an impact. So also, in terms of voting rights, there is an argument whether this would providing the voting right would prevent children from participating actively in climate change matters. And I also disagree with this argument. They would most probably, children who are active climate citizens would exhaust their practices to be involved directly in political engagements, such as voting and going to the ballot boxes, but they would also exhaust other means of public participation, such as being involved in public consultations or in governance processes, or going to the streets to protest. And now I would like to showcase you the three major areas of public participation of children that I write about in my book. And I had this idea that I will not talk to you in details about these pathways, but I will read from my book an extract for each of them, and this will give you more of an insight on what happens on the ground. So first of all, how children participate or do not participate in high-level conferences on climate change. Let me start with this. So this on the slide, you see a poster from 2019, which was about a Youth Climate Summit at the United Nations level, which was organized in New York, just ahead of the big United Nations Climate Summit, together with the General Assembly. So the UN Youth Climate Summit and the UN Climate Action Summit were held one after the other in September 2019. Both events were convened by the United Nations Secretary General and were the first of the kind. They aimed to provide global political response to social movements and demonstrations for the climate led by youth, which intensified and mobilized millions of people in the years of 2018 and 19. Actually, just to tell you, this Youth Climate Summit was organized on the 19th of September, the exact same day when the youth social movement peaked in the streets with more than 7 million people around the world protesting in the streets. So I, as a researcher, intended participating in the Climate Youth Summit on an observer status. But my applications was declined, primarily because of overbookings, and secondarily because of a highly selective admission procedure where young adult climate leaders enjoyed priority. The minimum age of application was 18 years. And only candidates with a high profile of community or other, for example, business leadership experience were among those selected in a Youth Climate Summit. Knowledge of the English language was also a requirement, as official interpretation was not guaranteed in all programs organized for the youth. From various resources on the gathering, such as video streams and media coverage, I observed this event as a researcher, and I also conducted interview after the summit with a representative from the United Nations major group of children and youth, which was present at the event. So this is what the interviewee told me. Everyone wants to work on climate change now. Many UN agencies want a piece of the pie. The UN Youth Climate Summit was a very political event and very criticized, formally convened by the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth and the Office of the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change. I'm asking this interviewee, what was the real objective of this youth event? And this person replies, oh, publicity, so there's different reasons to do it. One, it's a good opportunity to convene young people and to provide space for them to share perspectives. The question is, how was that space facilitated? And well, but I think there was something that they did really well. It was mobilizing funds. So they made sure that one person is funded from 100 different countries. That means that they had a very good representation from low and middle income countries. But I am not sure that they were very good at executing, though. It's like they want to do the right thing, but something is inconsistent. They did not engage the former constituencies, such as the major group of children and youth, or YOUNGO, which is linked directly to the climate change governance structures of the United Nations. Some of the speakers were randomly selected. And the interviewee talked about the trends of individualization in UN summits, which from a youth group's point of view is a constraint. So this is what this person said. And there was no speaker from YOUNGO or a formal youth constituency at the big Climate Action Summit either. There was Greta. She is cool. Her message is good. She's mobilizing all these climate strikes, which is what we need. But the problem is in the UN, this increasing trend towards individualization. So the UN wanted her to be there because the GA is a show, the General Assembly. But she was not there formally on behalf of the youth constituency, which is thousands of organizations of young people. So that's a lot of challenge we have in the UN nowadays. How do we make sure that the limited spaces in the UN will actually go to the collective movements or constituencies that have this principle of inherently universal and equitable access? And now I will, so that's basically my idea about youth involvement or children's involvement in high-level climate events. But I recently heard a new expression related to the COP28, we just finished a couple of days ago, and it was youth washing. So that's also something that we can apply here. And then we can go on to the social movement activism. So the Fridays for Future, I discuss in the book mainly the Fridays for Future social movement activism, because that is the social movement that involved mainly children and high school age children, because this movement stemmed from weekly school strikes. So basically children walked out of schools during classes or school hours and went to the streets on a weekly basis to march for the climate. And this is what I brought to you on new developments. So we all know a lot about how these children protested for years before the pandemic and even after the pandemic. But I want to show you something that is rather new, which is about intersectionality of social movements. I conducted case studies in Hungary in late 2022 with individual climate activists on identification, their beliefs, and intersectionality of the social movements. The study was based on 3 individual semi-structured interviews with activists who in previous years were affiliated with local climate activist groups. For example, the Fridays for Future social movement in Hungary. The age of the interviews was 17, 18, and 21 years. However, all of them were engaged in climate activism at the age of 15, 16, and one of them even from 13 years. All 3 interviewees strongly identified with environmental protection and climate change. All 3 identified with human rights issues too, such as gender equality, social justice and poverty, and racial discrimination. They justify these interests on different grounds though. One felt that sensitivity against injustices is a characteristic of youth in general. One said that these issues are part of their own political ideological thoughts and beliefs. And one said that in Hungary, specifically, injustices related to the mentioned human rights issues are prevalent and cause tangible tension in the society, which needs to be fought. One of the interviewees told me that other former climate activists whom she knew from the Fridays for Future Hungary movement in 2019 also typically engage actively in social justice movements. However, at this moment in time and politics in Hungary, they feel that they need to prioritize between social political issues and environmentalism. And just a couple of months ago, in October 2023, the Fridays for Future Hungary, so a social movement for the climate, actually declared that the right to quality public education is the priority of their climate agenda. Okay. The third pathway of public participation that I examined was strategic climate change litigation. there are more than 2,000 climate cases filed around the world at this time, and out of those, about 400 are filed against governments, and about 35, maybe even up to 40 involve children. There are also some cases which do not involve children as plaintiffs or as legal actors, but they argue on the basis of children's rights. But these are very rare, actually. So in the book, I discuss a couple of cases from the Juliana versus US. This is a federal litigation in the United States. And then on the global level, at the litigation filed at the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, and at the regional level, at the European Court of Human Rights, the Agostinho and Duarte case, which is also an ongoing case. Oh, sorry. But I will read you an extract about the Juliana case now. Just to give you an insight how children get involved in these cases, especially in the US, because it's important to highlight that the United States leads the number of climate change litigation proportionally, so especially those that involve children. So the originality of the Juliana case, besides the unique and pioneering motion to hold the United States government responsible for violating the constitutional rights of the plaintiffs, lies in the idea of enabling and empowering young individuals, almost all below the age of 18 at the time of the submission of the petition, to act as plaintiffs in their own right in a class action. Some of these plaintiffs had been publicly known as environmental activists from a very young age. Although they have legal representatives in court provided by Our Children's Trust, outside the court, the young plaintiffs appeared confident and equipped with knowledge about the procedure and their role in it, as well as about climate change, including its causes and impacts. Furthermore, Our Children's Trust has been transparent in communicating information about the plaintiffs, although such exposure is also instrumental in terms of developing emotional involvement and support on the part of the public. Not only can the names, faces, ages, and the states of origin of the young plaintiffs be identified through the information provided on the case's website, for example, the tremendous amount of publicity on the case, interviews, videos, TED Talks, documentaries, press conferences, and social events has engendered the sharing of personal stories. Parker and colleagues, scholars, refer to this strategy as storytelling and remark that Juliana versus US exposes personal stories to connect climate science to personalized injuries and to win the public for the case. Indeed, Our Children's Trust pursues the storytelling strategy intra and extramuros of the court in order to strike a chord with the legal actors, as well as to gain support from the broader public, for example, through amicus briefs or to fundraise for the costly case. Okay. So one of the findings of my research, which I present in the book, is that these various pathways of public participation are cross-cutting, and children as active climate citizens do tend to identify and also to exhaust all sorts of public participatory routes that they can discover and they can apply. So activism, litigation, school strike, clicktivism, online activism, and other engagements in public consultations, citizens' assemblies, deliberation, etc. I want to just to give you a couple of glimpse on what is happening these days on the ground. So the intersectionality, I have given you an example from Hungary. It's been a trend of the social movement activism of Children for the Climate, that they engage in other social justice issues, especially on racial, gender, indigenous issues, but also as you've seen in areas such as public education. And there's also a trend of the decreasing number of activists in social movements among children. It could be possibly because children who initiated these social movements back in 2018 are already adults, and these days children are joining these movements in less numbers than before. It can also be that the movement is facing a fatigue or a burnout and being disappointed at the lack of impact that they could achieve on political decision making. And also there is a sign of radicalism in social movement activism, although not too many examples among young people especially. But we have heard recently about cases such as throwing tomato sauce at Van Gogh pictures in museums. So that could be also something to look at for researchers. And then developments in law. So it's very important to highlight that the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child has recently issued a new general comment on children's rights and the environment with a special focus on climate change, which is an instrument, which is not a legally binding document, but it provides a very strong implementation guideline for children's rights, for environmental protection and climate change matters, and it includes, of course, the children's right to participate in different forms in climate change matters. The instrument falls short to address public participation as an express right to children. And there are numerous reasons for that, but I'm not going into the details now. But it definitely strengthens the framework for children to participate in climate change matters. And then litigation is on the rise still, especially human rights-based litigation and those litigations that are initiated even by young people themselves. And then there is also a trend on looking at how children's voices can be represented also in relation to intergenerational justice and children being linked to the future generations as the voiceless groups. I don't necessarily agree with this approach, but it has been also increasingly debated in scholarly discourse. And that being said, research and policy and advocacy about children's involvement or children's participation in climate change matters is also on the rise. So when I started my research, I had to face with the fact that there was very limited amount of previous studies or literature on children's involvement in climate change governance. And these days, there have been much more research going on about especially climate change litigation and social movement activism. And of course, we still have we will have the Code Red for a very long time. and the global warming doesn't seem to stop. It's here to stay. But I don't want to finish my presentation with this very bad news. So I wanted to give you some fruits of thought, maybe for the discussion that comes now, about intergenerational considerations. So what you think about children being identified with future generations. I tell you that my point of view is that children should not be identified with future generations, because they are a currently living generation with human rights provided to them, while future generations are non-existent at the moment. They will be existing in the future, and they don't have expressed legal frameworks for their human rights. And also, I argue in my book that children are often burdened with the intergenerational justice issue, and they are expected in political rhetoric, also sometimes even by the litigation strategies, to carry on their shoulder the representation of future generations. And of course, we can also look at whether this approach of linking children with future generations can be beneficial to both groups, or we could also approach it from a totally different perspective. Let's say from there is a new movement based on decolonization of human rights of future generations, or human rights of currently existing generations, and linking basically humans and non-humans all together as rights holders in the face of the climate crisis. So this was my presentation, and I am really looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Kata. You really have done such important work, and I really am looking forward to seeing where this research goes in future. I see we do have a question. I also welcome the audience to raise their hands or put comments in the Q&A or chat if you have a question. We will then start with the first question. You are welcome to ask it. Yes, I think Anania.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Anania Ndondole. I'm the National Youth Chairperson of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Tanzania, and I was a participant of COP28 in Dubai for the whole period. So I thank you, Kata, for this wonderful and credible work you have done for the publication of the book. I have a question. Maybe if you explained anything about children with disability, I would like at least to know more about it. And how can you explain the intersection between climate justice and human rights? Thank you.
Angela, should I respond directly, or shall we wait for other questions?
I think you can respond, and then we'll see if anyone else is welcome to ask a question or raise their hand. Thanks.
So thank you so much for the question. Yes, you're absolutely right to point out that vulnerable groups of children, such as children living with disabilities, or indigenous children for that matter, are not really discussed as a separate group of children in the book. And it could be a shortcoming of the book. And it's definitely something that I am looking into in my current work. I have also been asked, for example, whether I want to talk about children's climate citizenship in relation to climate refugee children or migrant children. It's something that I haven't considered, because when I built this concept, or when I established this concept of children as climate citizens, I thought about all children. So I didn't want to make distinctions between different groups of children on the basis of distinct characteristics such as vulnerabilities. But it could be something to look for in my forthcoming work. I think that in terms of public participation, especially in empowered spaces such as the COP28 that you attended as well, of course, other legal instruments and other rights, special rights, apply to children with disabilities. We don't only apply the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also the Convention on people with disabilities. So it strengthens the obligation of duty bearers as well. But once again, I want to emphasize that when we talk about human rights in general, it comes down to the duty bearers' perspectives and willingness and attitudes, whether they really want to engage in implementing human rights in a meaningful way. And the intersection between climate justice and human rights. So I'm not sure what you would really like to me to discuss here, but I see that climate justice issue has been framed as a social justice issue, and as a social justice issue, it really intersects with a lot of justice areas, such as I mentioned, gender issues, racial issues, as for young people, especially when the social movement activism was really at a peak, just in the midst of the pandemic as well. The Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, really had an impact on the climate social movements of young people. And also the Me Too campaign had some impact, and as you see, there are other social justice issues, such as the right to education or to quality education. So yeah, definitely intersects. I totally agree with that, and it's something I would really like to look into in my forthcoming activities. How children engage in different social justice issues while they also represent climate activism or climate citizenship.
Thank you, Kata. We also have a question from Ron Gazai. Ron Gazai?
Yes. Thank you so much, Angela. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. And thank you so much, Kata, for an amazing presentation and the book that you have worked on over the years. Indeed, climate change and children's rights, it's like a hot cake. Everyone is running to do research and to do work around the area. And you raise interesting points around, the belief of future generations, intergenerational conversations around climate change, and the challenge that we indeed meet. So 2 questions from me. The first one is whether in your research you explored the role of the United Nations Human Rights Treaty bodies, such as the Committee on the Rights of the Child, in pushing for child participation, or in creating spaces for children to participate within climate conversations and dialogue and climate discourse. Then the second one is are there any findings from your research of the potential or real danger or harm to child participants, especially when they are placed at a global platform to advocate for climate change happening in their city, in their community? And the assumption is that they appreciate what's happening globally. And then, a footnote to that question is there no possibility of professionalizing child participation, especially when they're, speaking at COP28, when they're speaking at the African Climate Summit, and these other high-level engagements and platforms on climate change? Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, so thanks so much for the questions. Yes, the convention, the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I did look into how two different involvements of children. One is during the consultation process about the new general comments on children's rights and the environment and climate change. And this involved thousands of children around the world being consulted on the draft documents and also being invited to spaces of the committee in Geneva. Not thousands, but some children were able to participate physically in consultations and express their views about their rights in the context of climate change and environment. So I think that the committee has made a lot of effort in involving children also on a representative basis. So they did pay attention to children in most vulnerable or most affected situations. But in terms of the result, I never miss to highlight the fact that the general comment doesn't mention public participation as a right. And I think that's a really disappointing outcome for from a children's rights perspective, because this right is not an expressed right until today, and it would have been a great instrument to provide children the right to public participation in governance processes, which is actually said in the general comment number 12, that children have the right to participate in policy making, also as a group of the society or civil society, and also at all levels of governance. So it refers to public participation, but not expressly. So it's a very interesting approach from the committee. They are very careful about providing the right to public participation, most probably because it's associated with also with the right to vote and the right to participate in political engagements directly. So that's something to note. And about professionalizing participation at high-level events. So what I'm actually currently looking into, it could be linked to your question, is how representation of children's voices in high-level events could be beneficial to both parties, so to policymakers or decision makers, and also to children themselves. But I specifically look into representation, not children's rights, but children's voices. So how children should be consulted at one point in the process, but not necessarily at the event themselves, because it's really, I understand that it's really something that's not very feasible to bring children into political consultations on climate matters. So especially climate change mitigation, the framing of climate action on just transition, energy policies, finances, etc., is not suitable for children. But their voices should be somehow represented. And this is what I am currently looking into, different approaches. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Kata. We have a question in the comments, which I will read, and then perhaps I can ask a question too. So the question in the comments is from Alan Basajasubi. I hope I said that correctly. Apologies, Alan. He's from Natural Justice, and his question is, thank you for the presentation. I have a question for clarification on your statement that children should not be burdened with intergenerational equity issues, considering the climate crisis, which invariably impacts children who are a vulnerable group that will be impacted from unsustainable development, considering the SDG framework, which speaks to the consideration of future generations in the sustainable development within the context of climate change. So I think, what do you mean by children should not be burdened with intergenerational equities, seeing, I guess, that the intergenerational equities surrounds children? And then my question, I was wondering whether your current or future research thinks about how different authorities should implement or strengthen children participation in the context of climate change. City authorities, for example, that really are the forefront of climate adaptation.
Andrew, sorry, could you read the question again, this last one?
Mine or the one in the chat?
The one in the chat, just this last one, because I didn't
one in the chat
hear it.
Whether you can clarify your statement.
Yeah, that's I understood. The second one I didn't hear well.
The second one was my question.
Okay.
I'm wondering whether your current or future research considers how can different levels of governance sort of implement your findings or strengthen children participation in the context of climate decision making. I'm thinking in particular about cities, the fact that they are really the forerunners or front runners at the first level of governance that has to make climate adaptation decisions at city level. Have you thought about that, or is that something you might do in the future?
Okay, so thanks so much again for both questions. I'm not sure how I actually phrased my standpoint on intergenerational justice, but what I wanted to express is my view on burdening children with the representation of intergenerational justice and also future generations. So when we for example, listen to statements or speeches from the United Nations leaders, they also often refer to children as the representatives of future generations. And I think that the political rhetoric really shifts the responsibility of children being responsible for intergenerational justice in that sense. The SDGs is an important tool in terms of formulating the duty of collective the collective duty of existing generations, including children, to protect the rights of future generations in the face of the climate crisis. But and I agree that children also have the duty to protect the rights of future generations, but they should not be burdened by the task of going out and speak for the future generations themselves, because they are not the only ones who are linked to future generations. Existing other generations can be also linked on different grounds to future generations. Why should it be children themselves? Or why should it be youth, for example, at high-level conferences? Because children are not present at high-level conferences, for that matter. And then youth are double or triple burdened by representing children because they are proxy to children on the basis of their age, and they are representing future generations, and they are representing themselves, their own agenda. So it's something that we really have to consider, whether we want children to be instrumentalized in a sense for carrying, you know, the flag of intergenerational justice, and not having other duty bearers to do the same thing. And then Angela's question, thank you, on different levels of governance. So my research, I mean, I had limitations in my research, and I chose to have a global outlook on public participation. And I didn't really go into local or community level. But that's definitely something that I would consider doing in the future, because I also see that there is a significant shift from climate change mitigation, which is done mostly at the global level, or discussed mostly at the global level, towards adaptation, which should be the responsibilities of climate action or adaptation in the hands of the local governments and national governments. So, and that being said, at the local level, children's involvement is much more feasible in my views, and and adaptation strategies especially, children should be involved throughout the whole process, and not only because they have the right to be involved in these public matters that affect them so tremendously, but also because they are key stakeholders in ensuring sustainability in the long term. So if they are involved in adaptation strategies, mitigation strategies as well, they can really help to sustain those actions in the long term throughout their lives, and even giving it further to the coming generations. So yes, definitely something to consider. And also, I'm really hoping that my book can also reach decision makers on not only on the global level, but also on national and local levels.
Excellent. Thank you, Kata. We are actually over time, but I'm going to allow one more question from Ron Gazai, and then we have to close for the afternoon.
Thank you, Angela. Actually, it's not a question, but just to highlight that my research around climate action is not global, but rather is centered on cities. And I think we can do a bilateral at some point with Kata, you know, how we can merge my work on climate change within cities and how children's rights can be protected and children can participate at that level. Thank you.
Yes,
That's
excellent.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it, absolutely.
I can also link the two of you via email. Ron Gazai is really doing South Africa proud. He is doing excellent work on children participation in cities. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining our last webinar of the year. Please do look out for further emails. We have exciting speakers lined up for next year. I think Jacqueline Peel is going to kick the year off us in 2024 towards the end of January, and we have a few exciting speakers for the first few months of the year. But on that note, Kata, thank you. I couldn't think of a better way following COP to finish this, you know, to complete our webinar series for 2023. Children are the future. Children are so vulnerable, they are so impacted, and they are often overlooked. So thank you again. I'm really happy that you and I met earlier this year, and I look forward to following your research. Thanks for speaking to us today.
Thank you so much, Angela, once again for the invitation, also for the participants for their attention and for the questions. And I wish you all a very happy ending of the year, and lots of success for the new year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kata.
This recording will be made available on our website as well. Right. Goodbye, everyone. Happy festive season.
Bye-bye.